Good morning, afternoon, and evening to our attendees and guests today who are dialing in from across Asia, Europe, and North America. By way of introduction, I am Rick Minchin, the Asia Scotland Institute's Head of Development. With me on the webinar today is our chairman and founder, Roddy Gao, and we are delighted to host a commentator who needs little introduction, Ryan Hass, to discuss his views on adapting America's China strategy in an age of competitive interdependence, as laid out in his book, Stronger. It is an exceptionally timely book, given the increasingly ideological nature of both the US and China's foreign policy, as driven by increasingly polarized domestic politics. While I'm sure most of you are well aware of Ryan and his work, I will begin by summarizing his career. In his book, Stronger, Ryan Hass examines the relative advantages of the United States as he considers US-China relations. I assume the title Stronger was chosen with a view first to making the US stronger, but also to strengthen the global community's ability to respond collectively to the challenges that face us all. Hass argues that while competition will remain the defining trait of the relationship, both countries will continue to be impacted for good or ill by their capacity to coordinate on common challenges that neither can solve on its own, such as pandemic disease, global economic recession, climate change, and nuclear non-proliferation. Ryan Hass has had a storied career, including a 15-year tenure in the US Foreign Service, during which time he has had direct engagement with his counterparts in China and across Asia. He brings a wealth of knowledge and direct hands-on experience with his peers in the region. He has served in the US embassies in Beijing, Seoul, and Ulaanbaatar. He has also served domestically in the State Department offices of Taiwan Coordination and Korean Affairs. Ryan is now a senior fellow at the Michael H. Armacost Chair in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institute, where he holds a joint appointment to the John L. Thornton China Center and the Center for East Asia Policy Studies. He is the interim Chen Fu and Cecilia Yan Ku Chair in Taiwan Studies. He was also part of the inaugural class of David M. Rubenstein Fellows at the Brookings Institute and is a non-resident affiliated fellow in the Pol Sci China Center at Yale Law School. Hass focuses his research and analysis on enhancing policy development on the pressing political, economic, and security challenges facing the United States in East Asia. Further, between 2013 and 17, Ryan served as the Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the National Security Council, where he advised President Obama and senior White House officials on all aspects of US policy in the region. Now, I would like to hand the room over, or the screen as it were, to our chairman, Roddy Gao, to get the discussion started. Many thanks.
Rick, thank you very much indeed. And Ryan, great to see you again. I was delighted to hear when we were chatting before this call started that 5 generations ago, your family left the Isle of Harris in the Hebrides to travel west to the United States of America, I assume. And so you're coming home, and we're delighted to have you here. We're talking to you in a week when the G7 are going to meet in the United Kingdom. And I have to believe that your phrase, competitive interdependence, is going to be on everybody's lips, as the largest economies in the world, most of them, try to figure out how to deal with China. And when you wrote your book, which was just before the inauguration of President Biden, I would be interested to know what prompted you to do it, and whether since then things have shifted and changed. So over to you.
Roddy, thank you, and thank you, Rick, for such a kind introduction. It really is. It's a conversation I've been looking forward to for some time. I wrote the book, as you mentioned, in 2019, early 2020, when the outcome of the U.S. presidential election was far from known. At the time, Joe Biden was polling 4th in Iowa, 5th in New Hampshire. It was far from certain that he would be the president. And I didn't write the book to get rich or famous. Fear sells in America, and this is sort of the opposite of fear. This is trying to make a case for confidence, that the United States and others can approach their relationship with China from a position of confidence that's born of awareness of our relative advantages and some of the limitations that China is going to face in the period to come. And I think that confidence matters because it's what enables steadiness, cool-headedness, and a bit of perspective about the nature of the challenge that China poses to us. And in recent years, I've grown a bit concerned that the anxiety and alarm and reactiveness have come to define America's approach to China. And, frankly, I don't think it's warranted. So I tried to set out to write a book that could provide a bit of a different orientation to how the United States interacts and approaches its relationship with China. And, I didn't know who the audience for this book would be when it was being written, but I'm delighted that it's Joe Biden. I think that he and I served together in the White House during the Obama administration, and I served alongside many of his advisors at that time. And I think that they generally see the relationship along similar lines. I'm not sure that they will use the same words to describe the relationship as I do, but that's okay. But I do think that your question points out an important point, that a lot has changed in recent years. In 2017, Xinjiang was not what it is today. Hong Kong was largely separate. Taiwan was not facing the pressure that it was. There were still term limits on Xi Jinping's term in power, and there wasn't the same level of repression. Nobody at the China-India border had died from violence in over 40 years at that point. So the relationship has changed, the world has changed, and it's I think only appropriate that America's orientation and the rest of the world's orientation to China would change as well.
Thank you very much, Rick. Over to you.
Thanks for that, for that, Ryan. Yeah, very, very interesting. You mentioned some of these regions, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and some of the developments that have happened. I think one thing that I find interesting as China expands its soft power in the regions that it's active in, and the US obviously focuses on how to maintain the soft power that it enjoys. It would be interesting for me to understand to what degree you think a focus from the West in general, but the US in particular, a focus on human rights and how successful that focus will be in terms of building and generating further soft power in the region. It'd be interesting if you could discuss that a little bit with reference to some of these new developments from a US point of view.
Sure, I'm happy to. I think that it's absolutely essential for the United States and its friends and partners who share common values to continue to raise these issues forthrightly, directly, at every appropriate level. And it's important that our leaders, as well as those below them, are on a common song sheet on these issues. Because when there's a gap between what bureaucrats are saying and what the leaders are saying, I think it's easier for Beijing to discount the strength of our concerns. We also, we need to approach these issues with a certain degree of humility and awareness that we're only going to have a certain degree of influence over how China decides to govern itself. And what I think that we should be trying to do is accelerate the process by which China reaches a conclusion that there is a better way for them to address the concerns they have in Xinjiang than the approach that they're taking now. Part of that is going to involve us living up to our own values. Part of it is going to involve ensuring that this issue is not narrowly a US-China issue. Because if it's a US-China issue, it's easier for Beijing to discount American concerns about these actions as a manifestation of a secure and declining power trying to suppress and hold down a rising power. What we want Beijing to hear, I think, is that this is a broadly shared concern that is impacting how China is viewed in the world, and it's having a significant effect on the degree of purchase that China has for the proposition that it's making, that it is the future and that it deserves to enjoy a certain degree of attraction. I've been in Xinjiang. I have friends from Xinjiang. It breaks my heart to see what's going on. And I hope that we keep it squarely in the center of our efforts to address the problems and challenges that we face from China.
So with that in mind, how would you suggest that the US ensures buy-in from let's say allies in the West? In particular, there's many in the West who have different priorities and different pressures, let's say, in terms of their engagement with the region. And so what should the US be doing to ensure that there's a common attitude towards these issues? Let's say with regards to Germany, for example, who's obviously highly involved in China.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question, Rick. I mean, first of all, I think that it's important to recognize that that important ground has been broken on this issue. The fact that the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the European Union jointly released sanctions in unison to deal with the concerns that they have about Xinjiang, I think provides proof of concept that there is a viability to this proposition. I think that exceeded Beijing's expectations of our ability to coordinate and cohere around a common challenge. But just taking a step back from Xinjiang for a second and thinking more broadly, I think that, the United States is going to need to meet our allies and friends where they are, than insisting that they come to us and see us where we are. Because as your question indicated, every country has its own messy relationship and sets of interest, objectives, and concerns with China, and they don't all overlap with each other. I think it also is important for us to start small and build, rather than framing the challenge in grand ideological or cosmic terms. Let's just simply find areas where our interests overlap, where our concerns are common, and then work on them, and allow confidence to build over time that we're capable of coming together to address these common challenges that we face from China. And on top of that, I think that a certain degree of patience will probably be warranted. We're only 6 months removed from from the Trump presidency, and I think that there are still question marks about what's going to come in the United States in 2024. And so it's natural, I think, for many of our partners to be a bit cautious in jumping on the bandwagon with the United States to go counter and challenge China. And I don't think that we necessarily should be asking our friends to come with us to counter and challenge China. But a certain degree of patience is warranted. At the end of the day, though, Rick, I'm fairly optimistic, because none of America's allies or partners want to see China engage in bullying behavior, repression at home, and they all want to see China do more to contribute to the challenges around the world that we all confront. And so that's a pretty firm, strong basis, I think, over the long term for us to build from.
Ryan, there's been a recent change announced in Beijing to move away from the wolf warrior approach to diplomacy. Is this just semantics, or is this a genuine recognition that perhaps they've overplayed their hand?
Well, Roddy, I would love for it to be a genuine transition, because I think that the wolf warrior dynamic has been harmful and sort of toxic in the international environment, but I think it's also been incredibly self-destructive and self-limiting for China. But the realism in me remains a bit skeptical that we're going to have anything more in the near term, other than maybe a different presentation to the same hard underlying nationalism that is informing the wolf warrior dynamic. I think as we look at the calendar with the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party this July, the Olympics next February, and the Party Congress next fall, my expectation is that Xi Jinping is going to continue to lean pretty heavily upon nationalism as a basis of legitimization, both for his time in power and also for the Chinese Communist parties. And the more pressure that China feels externally, the more vulnerable it feels internally. I think the more that nationalism will provide this sort of agent of cohesion. And so I hope that China phases through this expeditiously, not just for China, but also for all of us. But I think that we should probably have pretty grounded expectations for the foreseeable future.
So, and I think I share your sentiments very, very much so. I think the wolf warrior diplomacy has been harmful to China's own interests and has made this kind of the dialogue that we need, the dialogue that you're promoting in your book, has made it more difficult. But as mentioned in the previous conversation, there's very different dynamics that with which each of the different powers in various regions around the world are having to respond to China and what they're doing. And so it's obviously still much to see in terms of how this is going to unfold. And it's certainly going to be a very interesting development. I think with that in mind, I'm very keen to understand, I suppose, a kind of two-factor question to understand how U.S. policy or engagement with China has changed since Biden became president. And then with that in mind, how Biden's relationship with its allies, U.S. allies, for example, is developing and changing, and how you see that progress and that development.
Yeah, I think that at the end of the Trump administration, China was viewed as, a source of deep ideological and philosophical stress for the United States. Great power competition was the defining attribute of American foreign policy, and China was the defining attribute of great power competition. And so to a certain extent, at the end of the Trump administration, China was a challenge that eclipsed all others in America's outlook on the world. And over the past several months, I think that we've seen some subtle but significant shifts in that orientation. Right now, it seems to me that China is a challenge that is embedded within a range of other challenges that the United States is trying to grapple with simultaneously. When Secretary of State Tony Blinken gave a speech about America's foreign policy priorities, he listed 8 priorities. The only nation state that was listed was China. So China, I think, is clearly recognized as the top nation state challenger to the United States. But it's not the only challenge that the United States can afford to deal with at once. I think it's born of a recognition that that for American people, they're most concerned about proximate challenges to their health, their safety, and their jobs. And so American foreign policy should be responsive to the top concerns of the American people. And so issues like jobs, technology, climate, immigration, restoring relationships with allies and partners, those have risen up the ladder of prioritization, and even as China has remained real focus of American foreign policy. But just to take it a half step further, Rick, I think that the Biden administration also has made some shifts in the way that it talks about and thinks about China. There isn't this sense of grand economic decoupling anymore. There's no one with that voice has a seat at the Situation Room, which is a departure from where we were at the end of the Trump administration. There will be selective decoupling around certain national security sensitive issues, but not whole-scale economic decoupling. I think there's also been a recognition that it's possible for competitors to cooperate with each other when it's in our interest to do so. Both Xi and Biden have embraced this notion, which again was a idea that was a bit vacant at the end of the Trump administration. I think that that just more broadly, China is considered now a source of long-term competition, and that the United States and China are going to need to coexist amidst this competition, or have competitive interdependence, whatever word you want to use, but that this is a condition that's going to be managed over the long term, rather than a problem that requires an immediate solution. And so these types of adjustments and shifts, they don't manifest in great headlines in newspapers, but they are sort of, the tectonic plates are a bit, and I think over time it will become much more apparent.
Excellent, excellent answer. Thank you. You mentioned actually that there's been a few change in dynamics, particularly domestically within the US, where the average US citizen's priorities have become, let's say, more apparent and more acute. I'm interested in your view on the other side of that equation from the Chinese perspective, and how the domestic audience in China is driving Chinese foreign policy, I suppose also with reference to Roddy's question about wolf warrior diplomacy, and how you can tie the different competing pressures that each of these power players have with regards to dealing with their domestic audience, and how domestic politics plays into this foreign policy dynamics that we're seeing.
It's a great question, and I think that it's an underappreciated issue. That Xi Jinping in the West is viewed as this person with immense power and influence, who's capable of bending the wind to his will and dictating every decision in every province from his perch in Zhongnanhai. The reality is that he faces political constraints just like President Biden does. They're different constraints, but they are still constraints. I don't think either political system will allow their leader to accommodate the other, or to be seen as accommodating the other in service of smooth and stable relations. And I think that to a certain extent, both leaders benefit from a certain degree of friction in the US-China relationship. It serves both of their domestic political interests and imperatives. We see it more clearly on the American side, because President Biden has talked publicly about how we need to invest in infrastructure and human capital and some of these other domestic programs in order to be able to keep pace and outcompete China. But we also see it on the Chinese side. There's a reason why Chinese spokespeople and diplomats exercise wolf warrior diplomacy, because it's popular. It sells well at home, even though it doesn't travel well abroad. And so that should tell us something about the environment in which policy in China is being shaped. The other feature I think that is important is recognizing and understanding China's diagnosis of the situation in the U.S.-China relationship. As I listen to my Chinese counterparts talk in various closed-door sessions and Zoom sessions and the like, and listen to statements by President Xi and others, one of the consistent through lines or threads of their analysis is that the problems in the relationship are just simply a function of shifting dynamics, shifting balances and relative power between the United States and China. And their prognosis is that the more that the gap in relative power between the United States and China shrinks, the anxious and reactive and aggressive the United States is going to be in trying to slow down that trend and keep China in place in a subordinate position to the United States. And so from their perspective, from their diagnosis, there's no value in moderating their approach, because they have said that they believe that trends are in their favor, that the East is rising, the West is declining, and that over time, the gap in relative power is going to continue to shrink, and the United States is going to become even scratchier in the process. And so I think that their remedy, their policy prescription is just to power through until they get to the other side, and the United States is forced to accept this changed balance of power between the United States and China. So I mentioned all that as background just to say that I think that we should probably have modest expectations about a significant improvement in the relationship for all these reasons, that China is on an inexorable course that will never change, or that there is going to be a collision or catastrophe that is inevitable.
It's a very interesting point of view, and I think with this in mind, I'd be interested to hear. I mean, obviously, you mentioned quite clearly at the beginning of the discussion how much has changed since you wrote the book Stronger. I'd be interested to hear your views. I suppose first on to what degree you agree with the Chinese diagnosis of the situation, and how relevant now is this 10-foot tall syndrome that's been discussed in the past as these dynamics evolve and change?
Well, I think I don't, I'm an American, so I don't naturally subscribe to China's point of view on some of these questions. I come at it from more of an American perspective. And I do think that there is something to be said, though. I will, grant the Chinese the benefit of the doubt in a certain sense that American approach to China has been fueled by a certain degree of insecurity. That we have been in recent years somewhat alarmed by the pace of China's rise, and so there is a certain validity to that viewpoint, and that's part of what I wanted to get at with this book, is that we don't need to go through our sixth cycle of declinist fears in the United States in the past 70 years right now, that we can afford to maintain a certain degree of confidence and comfort in our relative position in this competition with China. And I think it's important for us to keep in mind that in the 1950s, not a lot of people were forecasting the diversion between the Soviet Union and China. In the 1960s, not a lot of people were expecting a cultural revolution. In the 1970s, it was far from foregone that Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening would take root and lead to double-digit economic growth. In the late 1980s, very few people forecast the Tiananmen massacre, and more recently, it wasn't obvious that China would shift from a low-key foreign policy posture to a proudly, aggressively, assertively nationalistic approach to its orientation to the world. So it's, China doesn't move along a linear path. And in the past, I don't expect that it will in the future. And so I think that there's probably also a certain degree of value in preserving a bit of humility and a bit of intellectual flexibility about understanding where China may be headed going forward.
A very interesting point. Thank you. So, I mean, I think this is interesting to kind of bring this back a little bit to what you would advise and how you would suggest the European Union and Europe in general position itself in this equation with these changing dynamics. I think you make very, very interesting points about the unexpected nature of the future, which is, it goes without saying. But how should the European Union and the United States work together to ensure that Western liberal values are maintained in the global order, assuming that China is able to achieve what it's looking to achieve?
Well, I mean, Rick, my first sense is that I expect that the European Union will want to maintain broadly productive relations with both China and the United States. That's okay. The United States is still the largest market in the world. We're still bound together tightly with our European friends with common values and common interests. And I recognize that China is viewed increasingly as the most important swing buyer in the global market, with a expanding middle class, increasing consumption demand, et cetera. I also expect that the European Union will want to be seen as preserving its strategic initiative, particularly in the eyes of Moscow and Beijing. And so therefore, I think that it's sometimes counterproductive for Washington to try to publicly dictate to our European friends what course they should take on some of these questions. So for example, trying to tell the Europeans how to negotiate their comprehensive agreement on investment through Twitter probably isn't the most effective way of managing some of these challenges. I also expect that the European Union will be fairly cautious in their approach to the United States on some of these questions until they gain a little bit more clarity about where the United States is headed over the midterm. But even taking all that as a given, I'm still pretty bullish on the ability of transatlantic coordination on China. And I'll just offer a few quick reasons why. The first is that at the heart of the competition with China is a question over which system is going to produce better results over the long term. Will a liberal democratic system be able to best unlock the potential of its people, lead to world-class innovations in technology and deliver solutions to global challenges? Or will a Leninist, state-led market economy deliver the results? That's an open question that is going to take some time to figure out what the answer to that is. But I think that the European Union and the United States have a pretty common stake in the outcome of that competition. So that's the first reason. The second is that I expect over time a little bit of the shine to wear off on some of these Chinese pledges about how transformative of effect they're going to have. I think that we'll have to see if the Belt and Road Initiative investments reach the grand potential that has been advertised. China's population ages as demand for social services inside China increases, as the Chinese economy cools. Will there be the same amount of capital available to deliver on some of these challenges? We'll see. And then the third reason is that I think that the United States probably will be more energetic over the long term in offering solutions to addressing many of these global challenges that we all confront. And that will just simply provide a larger surface area for the United States and the European Union to come together in common cause to address some common challenges. So I guess where I'm trying to take the conversation, Rick, is to the idea that we don't necessarily need to be anxious and insist that the European Union commit itself to America's course for dealing with China. With time and patience and steadiness, I think that it will be a natural resting place for the United States and the European Union to find themselves on the closer end of the triangle with China.
I think it's an excellent response, Ryan. I think with that in mind, it'd be interesting to hear your views on what China's key domestic pressures are in terms of achieving their goals. I mean, you mentioned, I think quite rightly, that China sees itself as the upcoming challenger to the global order, and clearly has a relative amount of confidence that it's going to be able to achieve this. While obviously we can all have our own opinions about whether or not that's going to be the case. It'd be interesting to hear from your point of view what kind of challenges China will face in that rise, and which areas that the European Union, the US as a partnership, and with the UK of course together, which areas we should all be looking out for to understand how that path is going.
Well, Rick, I know that you've lived in China and been around China for a long time as well. So I hope that you and Roddy will jump into this with your own diagnoses. But from my perspective, authoritarian systems are very good at advertising their strengths and concealing their weaknesses. And democratic systems are sort of the exact opposite, right? We talk about our problems, our warts, our challenges, our limitations in the public every day. And so part of this, creates a bit of a distortion in how we view each other and view ourselves. But I think that, if you sort of were to step back and take a look at the strengths and weaknesses of both systems, China has immense strengths. It also has very significant limitations. Its economic challenges are likely to grow in the coming period. And this matters because China has it's made its case as the agent of the future by sort of suggesting that it is going to be the economic engine of the world economy. And we'll see. I don't expect that the Chinese economy is going to fall off a cliff, but I also don't expect that it's going to continue on a rocket ride into the future indefinitely. The reality is that China faces challenges on sort of the three legs of economic growth in terms of productivity, labor, and capital. Capital is not being allocated very efficiently at the moment inside the Chinese economy. They're working on improving that, but to make progress, they're going to need to sort of wrestle the role of state-owned enterprises to the ground, which is going to be a pretty formidable challenge. In terms of labor, I think that the Chinese economy is post-peak in terms of its labor force, and it's going to be on a downslope for the foreseeable future. And given that China doesn't have a history of immigration, they're sort of dealing with what they've got, right? And they're going to have less and less going forward. And then in terms of productivity, we'll see. The recent record doesn't lend a lot of optimism, even in spite of a lot of technology coming online. There hasn't been a real bump in China's overall total factor productivity. So I think that there are legitimate causes for question marks about China's economic growth trajectory. And then if you take a step back further, China's political system faces some stress. It's become a bit sclerotic as more power has been concentrated at the center. I think that it sapped a little bit of the innovation out of China's political system. Previously, there was a lot of local experimentation. The Shenzhen was a fishing town 45 years ago, but it was identified as a place where experiments could occur in terms of economic openness, and now it's one of the most booming cities in the world. Is there another local leader in China right now who has the same empowerment to experiment that there's in China? I'm not sure. I think that's an open question as well. If you look at China's geography, I think it faces the hardest geography in the world, bordered by 14 countries, territorial disputes with 5 of them. 4 of them are nuclear powers. None of them want to be subordinated to China. And then there's the issue of food and energy security. China relies upon imports for food and fuel for its economy. And that's a vulnerability, particularly if we find ourselves in a confrontation or crisis. I could go on, but I think that that's sort of a flavor for what I wanted to try to bring to light.
No, I think in general, I very much agree. I think I'd like to kind of refocus a little bit on the stresses the political system faces. And I think with that in mind, I mean, my awareness, certainly having lived in China for a long time, is that when I first got there in 2010, within the Communist Party, there was a lot of debate about how the country should move forward. And within that, there was, like you say, a lot of experimentation about how best to approach various systems at different levels of the economy, different at the provincial or city or regional level. And so I'm interested to hear your perspective. I suppose the first part of this question is to hear your perspective on the level of debate within the party in China, and how open that is from your recent experience, and if that's changed at all recently. And then just to kind of add on to that question, whether or not you have peers in China that have read your book and what their views on your outlook is, and if you've had any debates with them over that. I think it'd be great to hear some perspectives along those lines.
Well, thank you, Rick. I mean, my general sense is that there is still a pretty healthy debate inside China about the political direction that the country is taking. It's much less visible than it was before. But China has not, since you and I left, it hasn't become a country of automatons where 1.4 billion people march in lockstep in a future direction. It's a messy place with a lot of very strong views about where the country should be headed. And let's keep in mind that the history of Chinese politics is a history of blood sport. From Lin Biao to the Gang of Four, there's been a lot of chaos and tumult, including as recently as Bo Xilai made sort of a last minute run for the throne and appeared to try to challenge Xi Jinping for that position. He now finds himself in a prison where he has been sent for a life term. No challenger in the current Chinese system has been rehabilitated. So everyone who's been sort of identified as being out of step and tossed overboard, it's unclear that there's a path back for any of them. And there's been a much greater reliance on repression than has been the case in the past. And it's a open question and a source of debate whether or not this repression is a sign of confidence or weakness and vulnerability. I think that you could make a case in either direction. But what we do know in past patterns of authoritarian systems is that when leaders begin to lean heavier and heavier on repression, it becomes a bit of a gateway drug. In other words, once you start using it, it's tough to stop. And that should give us all a certain degree of pause. On the reaction from my Chinese counterparts to the book, it's been interesting. One reaction, sort of the most superficial reaction, has been, why isn't Taiwan on the cover of the book? Because the cover of the book has pictures of continental United States and continental China, and that has come up in pretty much every conversation I've had with Chinese counterparts. I mean, I tell them that my in-laws are from Alaska, and Alaska's not on the book either, so take it easy on that front. But anyways, the other reaction has been, can the United States really do what you're suggesting it does? In other words, can it repair its alliances as thoroughly as you're prescribing? Can it renew its domestic dynamism? Can it restore its global prestige in the manner that you're describing? And I think that there's been some questions and some curiosity on that front. But the final thought, Rick, is that the timing of the publication of the book has also fed into a bit of a debate inside China around this whole narrative of the East is rising and the West is declining. And it has, I'm told, it has contributed to a bit of a discussion about whether or not that narrative has been overcranked inside China, whether or not that narrative is activating the type of response that China's strategy for a long time has been designed to prevent. And whether or not a bit more focus on some of China's own problems and its own slowdown may be in order. The one reaction that I have not received from anyone in China thus far to the book is any challenge to my diagnosis of the limitations or challenges in the future.
Precisely what I was about to ask, actually. So thanks for answering that. And I think that brings us pretty well onto the question and answer from the audience session. But it's been absolutely fascinating. Some great responses. I'll start off with a question from Nozumu Takaoka. So he mentions, as will probably be agreed today, joining TPP should be one of the best options for the US to respond to the Chinese challenges. Now that it was formally agreed to start a negotiation for the UK to join TPP, whose aggregate GDP, including Japan, Canada, Australia, etc., would be roughly the same size with the EU after Brexit, will these developments encourage the US to join TPP as well?
Well, I appreciate the question. My heart says yes, my head says no. I wish that the United States would join TPP because I think that it would put us in a stronger position over the long term and have greater effect and influence and impact upon China. But the politics in the United States around trade are pretty complicated at the moment, so I don't expect that there will be any near-term shift. I do think it's important for London, though, and I encourage London to go down this path. In a post-Brexit world, I think that London needs to find as many trade and investment opportunities as it can, strengthen its ability to attract investment to the degree that it can. And the TPP seems like a wise move. Further linking, just caution I would offer to tack onto this is that I think that Americans are less anxious now than they were 6 months ago about other countries' relationships with China, but they are more concentrated in their concern around technology issues. And I think that that's widely understood in London and elsewhere. But I think that just a certain degree of protectiveness around that issue would provide healthy buffering for the United States-UK relationship.
Ryan, I should just point out that Nozuma-san is the Japanese Consul General to Scotland here in Edinburgh, and he's a constant, strong follower of what we do. And I wondered if I could just ask you a question, which is that I think you said that we should encourage China to be ambitious and not aggressive. So why should China not have real influence in Asia?
I don't have any problem with China having influence in Asia. I think that it's natural and normal. With 1.4 billion people, a proud history, a dynamic economy, I don't see how we could prevent China from having influence in Asia. I don't think that it's an available option for the United States, the United Kingdom, or anyone else to try to push China back within its borders and have it live in angry isolation. But I do think that that as we encourage China to exercise influence, we do so in a way that is mindful of some of our top concerns related to, values issues, but also freedom of navigation and overflight, peaceful resolution of disputes, and enabling and allowing open access to Asia. If China were to try to limit or prevent any of our access to this most dynamic region of the world, I think that we would find ourselves in some real problems. And so I think that it's imperative that as China increases its influence, so with a keen awareness reinforced on a regular basis from all of us of where it should avoid overstepping.
I think as a good follow-up to that question, we have a question from Mark Hartree, who asks, do you consider that China sees its Belt and Road to be the success it hopes for itself and the countries it invests in, and conversely, a threat for the West looking in on it with envy or fear?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, my general view is that our initiative is a pretty good mobilization exercise. It's a phenomenal marketing exercise. And it's an initiative that predates the actual announcement of the Belt and the Road. China had been talking about infrastructure diplomacy well before Xi Jinping. They knew that they had surplus capacity in steel, cement, plant labor, that they were going to need to find a way to get outside of their borders. And they also knew that if all of the capital stayed locked inside of China, it would have deleterious effects for them at home. And so it was I think a pretty effective pressure release valve in a lot of areas. I think the Chinese also believe in infrastructure. It's been such a key backbone to their own economic development. So it's an issue and an approach that's born out of their own experiences. But at the end of the day, the world has a shortfall of $94 trillion in infrastructure between now and 2045. China has basically pledged to contribute $1 trillion to meet that infrastructure shortfall. We should applaud them on taking 1% of the global problem off of the table and come together as an international community to figure out how to address the other 90, 96, 97, 98% of the problem that remains outstanding. Let's treat the Belt and Road Initiative as what it is, and importantly as what it is not, which is a solution to a challenge.
Excellent. Many thanks. I think staying within the kind of Belt and Road region, I have a question now from Nicholas Chung, who asks, given the consistent changing economic structure of the global economy, particularly the rising importance of Southeast Asia as the global factory and China's dependence on imports going through the Malacca Strait and the South China Sea, I was wondering if relations with Southeast Asia or ASEAN will take greater precedence after the pandemic?
I think that that's a prescient question. I expect that China will continue to increase its focus on expanding its influence in Southeast Asia. You know, for a long time, Rick, there was this debate or question in Washington about whether China would try to consolidate its leadership position in Asia and then use it to broaden out to the rest of the world, or whether or not China would try to pursue leadership in Southeast Asia at the same time as it pursued leadership around the world. I think that what we've learned in the last couple of years is it's the latter, that Southeast Asia is not the stepping stone to the rest of the world, but it's a piece of a broader puzzle. My general view is that China is going to increase its focus in Southeast Asia. We're going to our game to meet that, but that the primary sort of the leading edge of China's efforts to expand its influence in Southeast Asia is mostly through trade and economic issues. And you know, to be sort of candid from an American perspective, that hasn't been a real strength of the United States approach to the region, particularly after the United States pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So if it's not a politically available option for the United States to rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we're going to have to come up with other initiatives, probably on an a la carte basis, to fill some of that vacuum and provide options and alternatives for Southeast Asians so that they don't feel like they're trapped into a narrower set of options for their future growth.
And so I've certainly seen from the technology industry, obviously with CFIUS restricting investment from China into the US on a lot of different technological areas. And then again with the Himalayas conflict between China and India, with India then also restricting technology investments in the region. It seems to me that China is doubling down on its efforts to take a part in the Southeast Asian technological expansion, let's say. And so it's certainly an interesting region to watch. And we'll bring it back slightly to security issues. So Anwar Zaidi asks, what were the key motivations for establishing the Quad, and what are the expectations from it for the long term?
Well, Rick, I'll try to provide a thought on the Quad, but I did want to pick up on your comment because I think it's a really important observation. You know, for a long time, China's sort of hierarchy of foreign policy priorities were great power relations, peripheral relations, and then relations with developing countries. And as their relations with other major powers other than Russia become more tenuous, and it looks like there's sort of less opportunity for advancement in a lot of those areas, and as its relations along its periphery become more challenged, as countries sort of react to China's expanding influence and increasing military capability, it feels like China is investing a lot more energy and focus in developing countries, which is sort of an inversion of the pyramid from where we've long sort of understood Chinese foreign policy prioritization to be. And I think that's a significant space that we're going to have to continue to watch going forward and think about how best to respond to. On the Quad, you know, my sense is that it is, even though the Quad leaders in their public statements don't talk about China, it's certainly you know, an initiative that is informed by an awareness of China's expanding influence and actions of China projecting more of its power and influence in the region. And I was heartened to see the Quad leaders when they met virtually for the first time last month or several months ago. You know, they talked about the need to accelerate vaccine development and deployment in Asia. They talked about the need to cohere around climate issues, climate mitigation and adaptation measures. And they talked about the need to accelerate technological development. To me, that's all to the better. If these four major democracies in Asia are able to work in common cause around these issues to deliver solutions to the challenges that are most proximate to the people in the region, that's great. And if it leads China to up its game to try to outbid the Quad countries in delivering vaccines to the region, the world will be a better place, right? So the more that we can sort of try to encourage a race to the top dynamic where each side is working aggressively to outperform the other in meeting the challenges of the region, then the world will be a better place.
I think encouraging a race to the top is a great way to frame it. In fact, and I think that's something very positive and optimistic I think we should all take away from this discussion. I think, and responding or related to that actually is China's role in multilateral organizations. And so Jacob asks, how should we respond to the legitimate wish of China to tweak international organizations while not letting China undermine their leading principles?
Well, this is an important issue that we should probably spend some time focusing on. My understanding is that China leads 4 of the 15 UN specialized agencies right now. Chinese citizens do. No other country in the world leads more than 1. That's an imbalance that plays to China's favor. The more that China exercises leadership in these institutions and organizations, the more they're able to sort of set the agenda and dictate the pace. And there are just certain areas where we should be honest with ourselves, where we have conflicting views, conflicting values, whether it's on internet sovereignty or the role of the state versus the role of the individual, whether we should prioritize individual liberties or social stability. These are real fundamental philosophical differences of views. And we have, we in the Western world have a stake in making sure that the views that sort of underpins the creation of these institutions continue to be alive and well going forward. My sense is that the rest of the world has woken up a bit to this dynamic, and that there appears to be a lot more coordination amongst like-minded countries around the selection of individuals. So we've probably seen the high watermark of Chinese influence on some of these UN organizations, but we're going to need to continue to work at this.
Yeah, and it's a highly important issue, and much still to be done. So I think take it absolutely. So we have a question from Jonathan Wang. The West has made wrong judgment or predictions about China many times, even just for the last few decades, which has in fact put the West in a less advantageous or more difficult position to deal with China. China is moving forward faster and bolder, with obviously greater impact on the world. Do you think the West, in particular the USA, are not making the same mistakes in reading what's happening and regarding what will happen in China?
Well, it's a good question, and I approach this question with a pretty high degree of humility. I've lived in China. I've worked with Chinese counterparts. I've been in meetings with Chinese leaders for a good period of time, and I can't tell you with absolute certainty where China is going to head next year or next decade. But I do have a sense that the United States can do is to strengthen itself. And the core strengths of the United States are domestic dynamism, our alliance relationships, and our global prestige, our ability to convene and galvanize global action to address common challenges. Those are things that only the United States controls. The United States is not going to be able to impose its will on China any more than China will be able to impose its will on us. The People's Republic of China is not going away. The Chinese Communist Party does not appear to be going away. And so the question is, how can we strengthen our own competitive position over the long term to continue to outpace the competition from China? And there will be a certain defensive element of that, particularly around technology issues. But much of the work that I'm putting forward is my argument in this book. Much of the work that can be done are things that we can control. And so let's put our energy and our focus on where we can have the greatest impact.
I think that's an excellent takeaway. I think we've just got time for one more question before I hand back over to Roddy to finish up. We have a George Magnus who's asking, first of all, Ryan, we're honored to hear your thoughts. You said America's main task should be to manage long-term competition with China. It wants to win, as does a Leninist China. But in real time, as it were, real issues such as the origin of the pandemic, human rights, forced labor, Taiwan and the SCS are liable to erupt, perhaps unpredictably. How do you think the US should approach possible smoking guns here? Are there red lines for Washington, do you think?
Well, I appreciate George's question. I'm honored that he would tune in and listen to us. I think that he raises an important issue that we need to be mindful of. I have a few quick reactions. The first is that those are all the issues that he's identified are absolutely essential issues for us to deal with. And we're going to have to deal with them forthrightly, directly. The more that China hears a chorus of voices around these issues, as opposed to just an American concern, I think the more impact that we're going to have. I think that it's important for us to bear in mind that that for conflict with China, it would be devastating for them. It would be devastating for us. They have their own incentives for wanting to avoid a direct collision with us. The United States and its partners still are in the dominant position in terms of overall national power. 9 of the 10 largest economies in the world are liberal democracies. I don't think that those facts are lost on our Chinese counterparts. And the more that we can be firm, steady, direct, but also providing, a path forward for the Chinese to continue to grow, as long as they don't do so in a way that implicates our values or our vital interests, then we have a shot at managing this complex relationship. The final idea that I would just put on the table is I think that our risk management and crisis management mechanisms are immature relative to what the Soviet Union and the United States had during the Cold War. It took the Cuban Missile Crisis for the United States and the Soviet Union to really get serious about crisis management. I hope that we don't have to go through a similar crisis in order to realize the importance of making progress on these issues.
So an excellent response. Many thanks. So I think to wrap things up, I'll pass back over to Roddy, and Ryan, many thanks for joining. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much.
Ryan, thank you so much. And Rick and Andrew, thank you for organizing this, this webinar. These things don't happen without people getting organized. And sometimes people have to get up early. I know 8 o'clock in the morning wasn't too early, but we did have one on one occasion that was 10 o'clock British Standard Time. It was 5 o'clock for me in the morning when I was, so we let you off a little more lightly. Ryan, thanks. It's a very, very interesting approach that you have to looking at our relationships with China. As I said at the beginning, when the G7 get together in the UK this week, I hope they're going to look at relationships with China and others in the way that you would encourage them to do so, rather than in the sort of rather more myopic and standard way of the past. I absolutely agree with you that we have to improve the mechanisms that we have for dealing with crisis management and in dealing with both China and Russia relations. And in that respect, I would just mention to people on this call that on the 24th, Thursday, the 24th of June, we're going to get a different view of, in this case, Russia, when Bill Browder is going to talk about the Magnitsky Act and his book, Red Notice, How I Became Putin's #1 Enemy. And we think that that's pretty topical at this time as well. But thank you, Ryan, so much for your time, for your comments, and for answering a decent number of the questions that those who've been listening have put. And it's great that George Magnus was on to ask you a question as well, an old friend of ours and a great supporter. And we look forward to seeing you in the flesh, as it were. And when people are able to travel again, you must come back and visit Paris, from whence you all came in the first place. So thank you.